The city never truly sleeps. Even at 2 in the morning, the streets pulse with movement.
$2 for the skewer. Here you go.
That's 50 cents change.
Stay hydrated. Long night.
And beneath all of it, beneath the concrete, beneath the traffic, beneath the endless noise of survival, lies unimaginable riches.
Is there enough water for today?
Barely. The prices keep rising.
Of the skyline like floating islands of wealth, and beneath all of it, beneath the concrete, beneath the traffic, beneath the endless noise of survival, lies unimaginable. Riches. Oil, gold, diamonds, cobalt, copper, enough natural wealth to transform the entire nation into one of the richest societies on earth. Yet millions of people here still struggle to afford electricity, clean water, or stable food prices. Entire families live inside unfinished buildings beside roads filled with imported foreign cars worth more than their lifetime earnings combined. Children sell fruit beside banks holding billions of dollars. Workers dig minerals from the ground that power modern technology, while many of their own homes remain dark during nightly blackouts. At first glance, it feels impossible, because from childhood, most people are taught a very simple story about the world. Nations become wealthy when they possess valuable resources. Hard work creates prosperity. Development follows. Opportunity, but reality tells a far stranger story. Some countries sit on oceans of oil and remain poor. Others possess almost nothing and become economic empires. Singapore has almost no natural resources. Switzerland built prosperity on mountains and finance. Japan industrialized despite limited raw materials. South Korea transformed itself from war-torn poverty into a technological superpower within a few generations. Meanwhile, nations overflowing with valuable commodities often remain trapped inside cycles of debt, corruption, instability, inflation, and dependence. The pattern appears again and again across continents. Like a shadow repeating itself through history, Venezuela possesses some of the largest oil reserves on Earth. Yet millions struggle through economic collapse. Congo contains enormous deposits of minerals essential to modern electronics. Yet large parts of the population remain among the poorest in the world. Nigeria exports billions in oil. While many citizens continue living without reliable infrastructure, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because the problem clearly cannot be explained by resources alone, and once that realization enters the mind, another uncomfortable question slowly emerges from the darkness. What if poverty is not simply the absence of wealth? What if, in some cases, wealth itself becomes the trap? That idea sounds absurd at first, almost offensive, but history keeps pointing back toward it. The moment valuable resources are discovered beneath poor nations, powerful forces begin moving toward them like gravity. Foreign corporations arrive, promising investment. Politicians fight for control over profits. Global powers suddenly become interested in regional stability. Loans increase. Contracts multiply. Corruption spreads like oil through water. The resource that was supposed to create prosperity begins attracting instability instead. Economists call this the resource curse. But even that phrase barely scratches the surface of what is really happening. Because the deeper you look, the more the modern world begins to resemble an invisible machine. A system quietly assigning roles to nations long before their citizens are even born. Some countries specialize in technology. Some dominate finance. Some control shipping routes. Some produce high-value intellectual property, and others remain trapped extracting raw materials and cheap labor for the rest of the system. The hierarchy becomes visible everywhere. Once you start looking for it, a worker in Congo mines cobalt used in electric car batteries sold for tens of thousands of dollars. Overseas, a farmer in Ghana grows cocoa while luxury chocolate brands in Europe generate enormous profits from finished products. Garment workers in Bangladesh sew clothing for global fashion corporations, while earning less in a month than some consumers spend in a single shopping trip. The people closest to the resources often benefit the least from them. That single fact reveals something deeply unsettling about the structure of the global economy, because modern wealth does not merely come from resources themselves. It comes from controlling the systems surrounding those resources: manufacturing, branding, banking, transportation, software, finance, global trade, and intellectual property. Raw materials alone are rarely enough, and countries trapped at the bottom of those chains often remain dependent on nations positioned above them. But the story becomes darker still, because many poor countries are not isolated from global prosperity. They are essential to it. Cheap labor keeps prices low. Resource extraction fuels industries. Weak regulations create profitable manufacturing hubs. Entire lifestyles in wealthy societies quietly depend on invisible labor, happening thousands of miles away. Modern globalization behaves almost like an iceberg. Consumers see polished products at the surface: smartphones, luxury clothing, electric vehicles, endless convenience. But beneath the waterline exists a vast hidden structure of factories, lines, shipping routes, debt systems, and labor markets holding the entire structure together. Most people never see it, and perhaps they are not supposed to, because the modern world works best when these systems remain invisible, when consumers believe products simply appear naturally inside stores, when people assume poor countries remain poor because they are lazy, corrupt, or backward, when history is simplified into stories about winners and losers instead of systems and incentives. But once the illusion begins to crack, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Why do international loans sometimes leave countries weaker instead of stronger? Why do global corporations profit enormously from resource-rich nations while local populations often see little improvement? Why do the same economic patterns repeat across entirely different regions and political systems? And, perhaps most disturbingly of all, what if poor countries are not failing inside the global economy? What if they are functioning exactly as the system requires them to function? Because the modern world did not emerge accidentally. Its foundations were built over centuries through conquest, colonialism, trade routes, industrial revolutions, banking systems, wars, and empires. The rules governing global power were written long before many modern nations even existed. And to understand why poor countries stay poor, we have to go back to the moment those rules were first created. To understand why so many poor countries remain trapped in poverty, you have to travel backward through time, far beyond modern governments, stock markets, and multinational corporations, back to the age of empires, back to the moment the modern global economy was first designed. Because the world we live in today did not emerge naturally. It was constructed piece by piece over centuries through conquest, extraction, trade, and industrial power. And many of the invisible economic hierarchies shaping nations today were built long before modern borders even existed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European empires began stretching across oceans, searching for spices: gold, silver, rubber, cotton, sugar, and land. At first, these expeditions looked like exploration, but beneath the language of discovery existed something far more systematic. A global economic machine was being assembled. Ships crossed continents carrying enormous quantities of wealth from colonized regions back into Europe. Silver flowed from Latin America. Cotton came from India and the American South. Rubber came from Africa. Sugar plantations spread across the Caribbean through slave labor so brutal that entire populations were consumed like fuel inside an engine of profit. And slowly, pattern emerged that would shape the future of global inequality. Colonized nations were rarely developed as complete economies. They were reorganized into extraction zones. Their purpose was not to become powerful competitors. Their purpose was to supply raw materials to imperial centers where manufacturing, finance, and industrial profits accumulated. That distinction changed the course of history. Take India, for example. Before British colonial dominance, India possessed one of the world's most advanced textile industries. Indian fabrics were globally admired for quality and craftsmanship. But as Britain industrialized during the Industrial Revolution, Indian manufacturing became a threat to British factories, so the structure changed. Indian industries were heavily restricted, while British manufactured goods flooded Indian markets. India increasingly exported raw cotton, while Britain captured the far more profitable industrial manufacturing process. One side supplied materials. The other controlled industrial wealth. The consequences lasted generations. The same structure repeated itself across much of the world in Africa. Colonial economies were often built almost entirely around resource extraction. Gold mines, rubber, plantations, copper belts, diamond fields. Railroads spread across territories, but many were not designed to connect local cities or improve domestic development. They were designed for extraction. Tracks stretched from mines directly toward ports, like veins draining resources outward toward Europe. Infrastructure existed primarily to move wealth out efficiently, not to build internally diversified economies. The Congo became one of the darkest examples of this system, under King Leopold II of Belgium. Rubber extraction became a nightmare of forced labor, mutilation, terror, and mass death. Villages that failed production quotas faced horrifying punishments. Human beings became economic tools measured only by productivity. Meanwhile, enormous fortunes accumulated thousands of miles away in Europe. The paradox was chilling. The regions producing immense wealth often remained deeply impoverished themselves, and this pattern was not accidental. Colonial systems concentrated power intentionally. Colonized nations were integrated into global trade as suppliers of cheap raw materials rather than creators of high-value industrial products. Industrial knowledge, banking systems, manufacturing technology, and financial institutions accumulated primarily inside imperial centers. Over time, this created a global imbalance so deep that many nations entered the modern era already positioned at entirely different starting lines. But perhaps the most destructive legacy was invisible. Borders across Africa and the Middle East especially. Colonial powers drew borders with rulers and pencils, often ignoring ethnic groups, languages, tribal territories, and historical relationships. Communities that had lived separately for centuries were suddenly forced into single states. Other groups were split apart across artificial national boundaries. Decades later, many of those same borders would erupt into civil wars, political instability, ethnic conflict, and coups. Some modern crises were not born naturally from local failures. They were embedded into national foundations from the very beginning. Then came independence. During the 20th century, colonial empires began collapsing. Nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America gained sovereignty. Flags rose. National anthems echoed through newly independent capitals. Colonial rulers departed to the world. It appeared freedom had finally arrived. But beneath the celebrations, something more complicated remained untouched: the economic structure itself. This is one of the greatest paradoxes in modern history. Political independence did not necessarily create economic independence. A nation could govern itself while still depending almost entirely on commodity exports. Foreign investment, imported technology, and international financial institutions controlled. Elsewhere, The faces in government buildings changed, but the architecture of dependency often remained exactly the same, and then the world entered a new phase. After World War II, global institutions emerged, promising development, reconstruction, and stability. Organizations like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created to stabilize economies and support growth. Initially, they appeared hopeful symbols of international cooperation in a world devastated by war. But over time, these institutions became deeply tied to global financial influence. Poor countries seeking development borrowed heavily for dams, highways, industrial projects, and economic expansion. At first, growth seemed possible. But debt slowly became another form of dependency. Loans came attached to conditions. Governments were pressured to privatize industries, reduce public spending, weaken trade protections, and open markets to global competition. Domestic policy increasingly became connected to international financial expectations. The methods of control evolved with the modern world. Empires no longer needed permanent military occupation to shape weaker nations. Now influence could move through debt, through trade agreements, through currencies, through financial systems so large and complex that ordinary people rarely noticed them operating above their lives like invisible weather patterns. And perhaps that made modern power even more effective than old colonialism. Because people resist chains they can see, but systems become far harder to challenge when they appear natural, inevitable, or invisible. By the late 20th century, the old colonial empires were officially gone, but the structure they built never truly disappeared. It simply changed form. Modern empires rarely announce themselves. They do not always arrive, with armies crossing borders or flags planted into conquered soil. In the 21st century, power often moves silently through contracts, debt agreements, trade systems, currencies, investment flows, and financial institutions so vast that most ordinary people never even notice them operating above their daily lives. And yet these invisible systems can shape the fate of entire nations just as profoundly as military conquest once did. This is where the machinery becomes visible, because poor countries do not remain poor through a single cause, not through laziness, not through one corrupt politician, not through one failed election or one bad decision. They remain trapped through systems, layers of incentives and structures that quietly pull wealth upward while keeping weaker economies dependent on stronger ones. And perhaps the most powerful mechanism of all begins with something deceptively simple. A country faces crisis. Its roads are collapsing. Electricity is unreliable. Factories are outdated. Food prices rise. Unemployment spreads through crowded cities filled with young people searching desperately for opportunity. The government needs money to stabilize the economy and modernize infrastructure, so it borrows. At first, the process appears hopeful. International lenders offer billions for highways, dams, railways, energy systems, and industrial expansion. Construction begins. Cranes rise above skylines. Politicians promise growth and prosperity. Newspapers speak about modernization and reform. For a moment, it feels like development has finally arrived. But debt behaves differently than most people imagine. Debt is not merely borrowed money. Debt is leverage. The more a country owes, the less freedom it often possesses. Because loans rarely arrive alone. They arrive attached to conditions. Reduce public spending. Privatize state industries. Remove subsidies. Open domestic markets to foreign competition. Devalue the currency. Cut protections for local businesses. These policies are often presented as necessary economic reforms designed to encourage efficiency and growth. And, in some cases, they do increase economic activity. GDP numbers rise. Foreign investment increases. Markets stabilize temporarily. But beneath the statistics, Another reality begins unfolding quietly. Public hospitals lose funding. Education systems weaken. Sometimes, the more valuable a country's resources become, the more unstable the surrounding system becomes as well. Because extraordinary. Wealth attracts extraordinary competition. Nigeria exports billions in oil. Yet many citizens still struggle with poverty and unreliable electricity. Venezuela possesses some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, yet economic collapse devastated daily life. Congo contains critical minerals, powering the modern technological revolution. Yet enormous parts of the population remain trapped in hardship. Meanwhile, countries with far fewer natural resources often develop stronger institutions, diversified industries, and advanced manufacturing sectors instead. The difference is not simply intelligence or culture. It is structure. Countries dependent primarily on raw material exports remain vulnerable to global commodity prices they cannot control. If oil prices collapse, national budgets collapse. If copper demand falls, economic crises spread rapidly. One shift in global markets can destabilize entire governments overnight. And while poor countries export raw resources, wealthy countries often dominate the industries surrounding those resources where the real profits accumulate. Technology, finance, branding, software, manufacturing, intellectual property. A coffee farmer may spend months growing beans worth only a few dollars per kilogram. But once marketing, transportation, finance, branding, and luxury retail enter the equation, the final product may generate hundreds of times more profit overseas. The hardest labor often receives the smallest reward. Value rises upward through the system like heat. This creates a global hierarchy where poorer nations remain concentrated near the bottom of supply chains extracting raw materials. assembling products, providing cheap labor while wealthier nations dominate the higher layers where financial and technological profits accumulate. And perhaps the most unsettling part is that this system does not necessarily require evil people to continue functioning. It runs on incentives. A multinational corporation seeks cheaper labor because shareholders demand higher profits. Politicians seek foreign investment because economic growth determines political survival. Consumers buy cheaper products because wages and living costs create pressure everywhere. Investors move capital toward the highest returns, regardless of geography or morality. Every individual decision appears rational on its own, but collectively, those decisions create enormous global currents shaping entire societies. This is why simplistic explanations for poverty often fail, because the system is not controlled by a single villain sitting inside a dark room manipulating the world. It is maintained by millions of ordinary decisions interacting together like gears inside an enormous machine. And inside poor countries themselves, local elites often become tied to external systems rather than domestic prosperity. Wealthy politicians and business leaders may store money in foreign banks, invest in international markets, or build relationships benefiting global corporations more than local populations. The incentives pull upward and outward rather than inward, toward national development again. No conspiracy is required, only structures rewarding dependency more than independence. Then there is currency power, one of the least understood forces shaping global inequality. Some nations control reserve currencies used throughout the world. Economy, this gives them enormous influence over global finance and trade. Poorer countries, meanwhile, often rely on borrowing in foreign currencies they cannot print or control themselves. When global interest rates rise in powerful economies, weaker nations can experience devastating consequences almost instantly. Capital flees, currencies collapse, inflation explodes, debt becomes harder to repay. Entire populations suffer because of financial decisions made thousands of miles away. This is why the modern world behaves less like separate countries competing fairly, and more like an interconnected web where powerful nations occupy central positions while weaker nations remain vulnerable to every movement within the system. And once you begin seeing the structure clearly, an even more disturbing realization emerges: poverty is not merely the absence of wealth, it is often a position within a hierarchy, a structural role inside a global system determining who extracts value and who captures it, which raises a question so uncomfortable that most people instinctively avoid it. If the global economy benefits from cheap labor, cheap resources, and dependent markets, then what happens if poor countries ever truly escape? The bottom of the hierarchy, what happens if the system suddenly loses the inequality it quietly depends upon?